The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
My baby dolls, we are back again. Another show, another Genesis episode. I love this place, you know. We're going to be talking classic baseball again today. We're going to be talking with author Steve Steinberg, who's doing his third tour of duty with me today. The first was with the Hugs and the Colonel, and we're talking about Miller Huggins and Colonel Rupert and the early Yankees. And we also did 1921, also with Steve, and in both shows, his partner over there, Lyle Spatz. We had great times. I think 1921 won the Seymour Medal Award. But here today, we're talking about Urban Shocker. No, I'm not talking about New York City in the late 1970s when I grew up. I was an Urban Shocker. But anyway, we're talking about New York City. We're talking about St. Louis. We're talking about New York City again, probably around 1915 to 1927. And pitcher Urban Shocker, who, again, before this book has been released, people don't really know a lot about it. I learned a hell of a lot from Mr. Steinberg's beautiful prose. We're going to get into the book. We're going to learn a lot about Urban Shocker today. We're going to learn why he was important, why he's overlooked, and what was his impact on the game. And I'll tell you one thing, this guy has a heart of a tiger when you listen to what he had to go through just to make it to the mound every day. You are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network with the Zigzag Man. And you know, we had a beautiful show yesterday. We had a couple of guys who were on the Hall of Fame committee for many years talking about the upcoming ballots. And again, my man Marvin Miller is on the ballot. Alan Trammell's on the ballot. Jack Morris is on the ballot. Steve Garvey's on the ballot for the what the Veterans Committee likes to call the modern age of baseball. But my picks, I'm hoping Marvin Miller gets in, and I'm hoping Alan Trammell, Morris, and Garvey get in, although Garvey, you know, his personal life got in his way, and of course he sued the Players Association during the whole collusion cases in the late 80s and 90s when he went bankrupt, so he was digging for money, and the appellate court said no to Garvey. But you can't deny a guy who had 1,100 straight games that didn't miss a game and still holds the National League record for most games, consecutive games played in a row. But you know, as for the players that just retired 5 years, I think Vladimir Guerrero's going to get in this time. I think Trevor Hoffman's going to get in this time. They were close in the balloting. You know, I think they're going to do justice. I think Chipper Jones is going to get in there on the first ballot, but we'll see. There's a lot of baseball to be had. The winter meetings are coming up. I'm getting into baseball withdrawal, but that's why we have the shows like this. And today, again, we're talking about Urban Shocker. And let me tell you something, what a great book. We all remember, if you were around in the late 80s, we had consecutive innings going on and shutout innings. And Urban Shocker for many years held that record. You know, it's so much information about Urban Shocker that people don't know. And Steve Steinberg, well, he's been bringing us baseball for the last 20 years. He's a baseball historian. He surely is, and his research is impeccable, I'll tell you that much. And his writing is really keen, so readable, very user-friendly. And I'm going to tell you before I go into his bio, go out, put this under a tree or a menorah or whatever holiday you celebrate at the end of the year, because it'll keep you warm during the January months. I'm telling you that much. Anyway, Steve is a baseball historian, and again, with his partner, co-author, Lyle Spatz. And you know, what I love about these guys, Steve's in California, Lyle's in Florida. All the big shots, they're like in warmer weather. I'm up here in Boston freezing my heinies off. So, again, they collaborated on the Colonel and Hug, the partnership that transformed the Yankees. They also did 1921, the Yankees, the Giants, and the Battle for Baseball, winner of the Seymour Award back in 2010. And right now, without any further ado, welcome to the show, Steve.
Thank you, Ian. Glad to be here.
Let me ask you, is this going up for the Seymour Award this year? Has the awards been announced?
Seymour doesn't get announced until early next year, and it's been submitted by the publisher, and we'll see.
No, it's a great book. Now, again, in doing my digging, like I told you before the show, and I always do my homework, this is really a special case with Urban Shaka because it kind of mirrors stuff that was happening in your life, and I'd like you to explain what was going on and how you got interested in Urban Shaka.
Well, Shocker has been many years in the works, as you said, and I had sold a retail company that I had in the late 90s and was wondering what the next part of my life was going to be. And my son, who was 10 at the time, and I used to go to card shows and card shops, and I had noticed this one baseball card at a card show that said Urban Shocker, and I assumed it was something that happened in one of the big cities, maybe a ball player who had been shot or whatever. And lo and behold, I find that this was actually a great pitcher in the 1920s, including an 18-6 record on arguably the best team of all time, the 27 Yankees. And then when I noticed on the back of the card that he was dead a year later, I was definitely hooked, and I had to find out more about this guy. And really, I've been drawn into baseball research and baseball history by the story of Shocker, which is a pretty compelling story, the more that I got into it.
Now, you know what fascinates me? You had a successful retail place, and this was no small deal. We're talking about 20 years of hard work, 500 employees all over the West Coast, and now you're going from that to sit around and researching stuff. How was the transition?
Well, the transition was not easy. I think when you have a way of life, and especially when it's one when you running a large company, it really is, now what's next. But in hindsight, even though it was a difficult transition, I think it was the best thing that ever happened to me, and really, found in many ways my calling to try to bring back ball players, that people who really have incredible stories who've been virtually totally forgotten. They've, as I sometimes say, they've fallen through the cracks of history, and in many ways, Miller Huggins and Jacob Rupert fit that profile also. But I mean, Urban Shocker is probably the best example of that, because even Yankee fans may know very little about him if they haven't yet read my book.
And let me ask you, what's interesting is this. The fact that you started your research with Urban Shocker in the 90s, as soon as you were getting closing up your retail business, but you didn't publish it until this year. Well, what was the holdup?
Well, I'm probably not the first author. I remember reading somewhere, not that I'm in his category, that Hemingway, one of his most famous books was his first one, and he didn't publish it for 10 or 15 years. I think at one time I was trying to shape this as a historical fiction book, thinking that I'd be able to do that and reach a larger audience, because it is such a compelling story that we'll get into. And but that really isn't my style, and it really wasn't. I'm really not the author to do that, and so I put it aside for a number of years. And then in about 2009, I just one day said, "Hey, I've got to get back into that," and that was the day before I had my annual physical with my doctor, and it was pretty incredible because Shocker, as we'll talk about, died of heart disease. And the very next day after I picked up Shocker, after literally years of leaving him aside, I discovered that I had some heart issues of my own. And so Shocker and I are linked in more than one ways across time, and his story, it was time to start pulling it together.
Let me ask you this. Here we go. Urban Shaka was a Midwestern boy, but yet he yearned for the big lights of New York City. What's going on with that?
Well, Shocker was born in Cleveland, spent a lot of time in Detroit, and the Midwest was really a hotbed of semi-pro and sandlot ball. And but as we'll talk, he was drafted by the New York Yankees, and he loved New York, he loved the big city, and he loved the Yankees. And his career was somewhat derailed because the Yankees traded him away. We'll get into that. And, of course, this is long before, many decades before free agency, and the likelihood of him being able to return to the Yankees was pretty remote, but it actually happened late in his career and late in his life.
Now, let me ask you this. He was one of five, he was the fifth of 8 children they were both of French origin, and he made his living as a machinist, his father. How did he get into baseball?
Well, again, he played sandlot ball, and I think, as I discussed in one of the early chapters, it was almost hard to believe in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland on weekends the number, literally hundreds of games were going on, and that's what he gravitated to. He didn't start it that early in life. He didn't even start his professional career until later in life. So, and he didn't reach the majors until he was, in his 20s. But I think in that era, baseball was king, and on weekends, I mean, it was just an unbelievable scene, and it wasn't at all surprising that that's what he decided to do.
And, he played not in warm weather. He played in semi-pro teams in both Michigan and Canada. How was his training in the great outdoors up there?
Yeah, I'm sure there were some cold springtime games, and of course in the minors they didn't go down to the south, and they made it, and they made it through, and there were many more minor leagues than there are today. It was just a very vibrant scene.
And let me ask you this. He started out as a catcher, Shaka. How did he get converted to a pitcher?
Well, he did start out as a catcher, and at one point in time, he broke the middle finger of his throwing hand, and when it was set by the doctor, it was set perhaps not properly. He ended up having a permanent crook on his hand that gave him a special break on his slow ball, what we would probably call a changeup now, and it was a pretty devastating pitch. And when he was early in his career, there was a shortage of pitchers for one key series, and he pitched, and he then left catching behind, and he was off to a career of pitching.
And let me ask you this. Although his record wasn't so good when he played in Windsor, he had a 6-7 record and a 4.54 ERA. His ratio of strikeouts to walks was 3-1. What did in your research, how did he control the ball, and was his spinner created at that time?
Yeah, Irvin was a spitball pitcher, and the spinner was banned in 1920, but the 17 pitchers that threw it at that time were grandfathered in. He had amazing control, and unlike some of the spitball pitchers, he actually threw it rather rarely, but control was really his forte, and he was just able to place the ball exactly where the batter didn't want it, right on the edge, and that was a key part of his success, the success of a pitch that some observers thought was a slow spitter or a dry spitter, and it really was his slow ball with that devastating break that he had to it.
Well, let me ask you this question. I know I asked you this question regarding the transition from the dead ball era to the live ball era. As we just talked about, Shaka admitted, look, he's a slow ball pitcher. He can change it up. He's not a fastball pitcher. The balls were different. Again, he used one ball throughout a whole game in the dead ball period because they didn't change the ball. Now, in the live ball period, anytime there's a mark on it, you can discard the ball. How was his transition from going from dead ball pitcher to live ball pitcher? In fact, I know you wrote about he feared that the spirit might be taken away from him, but I think he was grandfathered in.
Yeah, he was grandfathered in, but because he had such an assortment of pitches, he wasn't terribly worried about that. And again, the control, he actually did throw a fastball. He even led the American League in strikeouts in 1922. But in that era, and I think, he had 149, which wasn't a big number. And as he got ill later in his career, his fastball pretty much left him. But still, it was the assortment of pitches. It was the cleverness. And Shaka, this is long before sabermetrics and decades before, computer analysis, Shocker made a real study of the game where he would buy newspapers from all the different cities every day and study what batter was doing, how well he was doing, and who he was having success and what pitcher was giving him trouble. So Shocker really made a study of it. And again, back then there were only 7 other teams in your league, so those 150 some odd players, he knew them very well and really pitched with his head as much as with his arm.
Let me ask you this. He played for the Ottawa Senators, and, I think he won something like 20 games one year, 19 games another. I think they won the championships. How did the Yankee scouts get up to Canada? I always say there was no airplanes to get you up around. You had to do it all by car. What was going on with that? How'd they get him in the Rule 5 draft?
Well, there were scouts that were out there. There were people that were out there. There were 2 newspapers. Of course, one was the Sporting News. The other was called Sporting Life. And they covered the minor leagues. And the Yankees, like other teams, did have scouts. And the word got out about Shocker, especially with his scoreless inning streak that he had. And, of course, actually that came with Toronto a year later. But his success, again, was covered in the newspapers, and word does get out. And then when they have the draft, it's very possible that more than one team drafts you. And so, there's not been a lot written about the draft back in those years, but the Yankees did land him and brought him to spring training in 1916.
Now, let me ask you this. Something weird about his name. His name was Shockor. That's Shockcor. How the heck did they change it to Shocker?
Well, his relatives were spelling it the traditional way, and I don't know for certain, but I think there were so many mistakes that were made that finally he decided to make it easy for the newspapers and the reporters and just simplified it. And in Ottawa, for example, for many years for many times he was called Herb, Herb, because people overheard someone saying to Urban Herb. And so it was a matter of getting it right. And in the case of his first name, they finally did get it right. There was another great spitball pitcher at that time, Urban Faber, Red Faber. But his last name, I think he just decided, hey, they're misspelling it all the time, and let's make it a little bit shorter for the box scores also.
Now, let me ask you this. During the spring training game, during 1916, Shocker was covering first base, but he was spiked on the foot by a base runner. What happened with that?
Shocker during his career had a number of minor injuries, and he had terrific recuperative powers, and that was the first one as a major leaguer, and he was expected to be out for a few weeks, and he came back, I think, in a matter of days. And keep in mind, this is before the era of antibiotics, so I guess he was a little fortunate from that standpoint, even though ultimately in the bigger picture he was quite unfortunate with his heart issue that we'll talk about.
Let me ask you this. The Yankees in 1916, they still were in the shadow of the Red Sox. And Shocker made his debut on April 24th, 1916. He pitched 3 innings of relief. This was a game against Walter Johnson. But why did they opt Shocker to the minor leagues, to the Toronto Maple Leafs, not the hockey team? But I love that.
Really?
I'm reading. I'm like, wow, there's a Toronto Maple Leaf team back there. Oh my God! But anyway, to head over about why did they send Shocker down?
Well, the 1916 Yankees were not a very good team, although they were very promising, and they actually had a lot of pitching talent. One of the guys at spring training was Dazzy Vance, who wouldn't win his first major league game until the 20s, and then went on to a Hall of Fame career with Brooklyn. And I think they wanted to give Shocker more work, and he did have a key relief appearance before they sent him down, where he gave up a home run to Napoleon Lajoie, the future Hall of Famer, and perhaps got a little bit too cute in that case with trying to move a fastball past the aging Lajoie. I think Lajoie was around 40 at the time. But the Yankees felt, let's get Shocker somewhere where he can work on a regular basis. And obviously they kept a string on him so they could recall him. And he had a truly phenomenal summer in Toronto, even though it was a very short one. The Yankees had to get their roster down to, I think it was then 25 men in the middle of May, and they recalled Shocker in the end of, or actually they recalled him in the middle of August. But during those 3 months, he really set the baseball world abuzz with his performance in Toronto.
54 and a third scoreless innings. He surrendered 2 runs in the 8th inning on July 26, 1917, in a 2-2 tie. But Shocker was 15 and 3 with a 1.31 ERA and 152 strikeouts in 185 innings. So then he was recalled to New York, and he went 4 and 2. However, what was the relationship between Wild Bill Donovan, who was the manager of the Yankees at the time, and Shocker? Because it seems he only used him sparingly.
Right. Wild Bill Donovan was a very successful pitcher with the great Detroit Tiger teams of 07, 08, 09, who won 3 American League pennants. And the 1916 Yankees, this is not very well known, actually stormed into first place. They were a bad team historically, and from about the end of June until the end of July that year, they were in first place until they had a devastating series of injuries. And that's when they recalled Shocker, and Toronto was not that happy to give him up. And Donovan really believed strongly in Shocker, but did not overuse him. And in 1917, he gave Shocker more work, but he was a big believer in Shocker's success.
Let me ask you this. So now Donovan is replaced by, of course, Miller Huggins, who would go on for the next 12 years until he died. How old was he when he died? He was like 51 years old. He died of a heart attack, I believe, Miller Huggins, right?
Well, he had a blood poisoning issue, again, before the era of antibiotics. And Donovan did manage again in 1917, and when the Yankees didn't win or didn't even come close to winning the pennant, Jacob Rupert and his partner, they did relieve him. And Miller Huggins came on board from the St. Louis Cardinals, where he'd been manager, and he traded Shocker even though he never saw Shocker pitch. And he said that he had gotten word that Shocker was a troublemaker, and Shocker did go out drinking, and he hung out with an alcoholic pitcher that the Yankees had who was incredibly brilliant, but whose career was really derailed by his drinking, Ray Caldwell. And Huggins made the move. He never did say, and I never really identified who it was in the organization that recommended getting rid of the troublemaker. But Bill Donovan, when he left, had said, don't trade Shocker. And Huggins did not take that advice.
Let me ask you this, because Huggins had a great infield. You know, they had Peckinpah, Roger Peckinpah at short, Frank Home Run Baker from the A's when Connie Mack decided to dump salary, and they had Wally Pipp, I think, at first. But Huggins, he saw a hole at second base, and so I guess with what you just said, he thought Urban Shocker was, disposable, and so he traded for Pratt on St. Louis Browns. And how did that trade go?
Well, you're right, and Huggins himself was a former, in his career, was a second baseman, and the Yankees were weak at that spot, and Del Pratt was a sensational ball player from the South, and that gave the Yankees a terrific infield, and Pratt had some power and was a great bad ball hitter. And it was a multi-player trade, and Shocker was one of a few of the Yankees that Huggins thought was disposable. And it gave the Yankees a terrific infield, but ultimately they were still missing a few pieces and would fall short of the American League pennant for a few more years until a guy named Ruth showed up.
Well, let me ask you this. They did get Eddie Plank in the deal. And people don't know much about Eddie Plank, but I think he went to the Federal League, I believe, Eddie Plank, if memory serves me correct, and he won his 300th game with the Federal League, which was not recognized by the Major League Baseball committee until 1968. How did Eddie Plank do for the Yankees?
Well, Plank for many years held the record of the winningest pitcher, a left-handed pitcher in baseball. I think Warren Spahn broke his record decades later. And Plank was aging and finally decided to hang him up. And I think he was the key guy with Del Pratt in the trade. And he wasn't bluffing. He wasn't trying to get a bigger contract. He just wanted to go back to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was known as Gettysburg Eddie. And opened an auto repair shop and never pitched again and never pitched for the Yankees. But the trade still remained. And they got just Pratt.
Yeah, and let me just ask you this now. Goes to St. Louis. Now he's going to break out. What goes on in St. Louis now?
Well, of course, America entered the war right before the Shocker trade, and Shocker was drafted, went overseas. Like many Americans, never faced any action because the war ended rather suddenly with all the American troops pouring in the summer of 1918. But he became a very effective pitcher, and he showed flashes of that brilliance before he went in the Army, certainly when he came back in the spring of 1919. And I'm sure it was that year that Huggins realized he had made a big mistake. And Miller Huggins made very few personnel mistakes, but that was the one that got away.
And let me ask you this. Regarding the St. Louis Browns, they were a bad team for many, many years. They were always overshadowed by the Cardinals. And how did Urban Shocker take to this transition?
Well, he was very angry at the Yankees, and he used phrases like "sold me down the river," and and of course, being traded to St. Louis in this era, and that was the westernmost baseball city, was like going to baseball Siberia, I suppose, and there wasn't nearly as much coverage, certainly not as much as there was in New York. The Browns were not a good team. Actually, the Cardinals in that era were not very good either, and the Browns were an improving team. But Shocker just took it upon himself that he was going to show the Yankees whenever the Browns would face the Yankees in a 4-game series. And usually the teams did play 4 games, especially in Eastern and Western team. They're so far away from each other when they take the long train trip. And Shocker would insist on pitching against the Yankees in Game 1 and Game 4 so he could beat them twice. And he had enormous success with the Yankees in the early years through 1921, beating them pretty consistently 2 out of every 3 games.
And you know something? Right now, the St. Louis Browns, I mean, the Yankees are now becoming the cream of the crop now with Ruth. Again, you got 21, 22, and 23. The Yankees basically win the pennant in 3 years. They win the World Series in 23. They lose the first 2 to the Giants. But in my studies, and I had the author, and Eclipse is my name, we had a podcast on Kenny Williams, and I learned so much from the St. Louis Browns with that podcast. Tell me about the 22 Browns, because that is just a remarkable team.
Right. The St. Louis Browns were improving in the early 20s, and 1922 was probably the greatest Browns team of all time, even better than the 44 team that won the pennant during the war. Although the 22 Browns fell 1 game short. They had an amazing outfield, 3 ball players that for 5 years all hit over 300, with the exception of one of them, Johnny Tobin. The last of those 5 years fell 1 hit short of 300. And they had a guy named Bob Quinn who was the general manager. They called him business manager in those days. And he was a very astute guy, and he picked up a number of players. And it's interesting, his granddaughter, I believe it's his granddaughter, is married to Roland Heeman, the respected longtime scout in Major League Baseball. and interesting connection. The Quinn family's been involved with baseball. I still think there's a descendant that works for one of the major league teams, but basically put that team together, and the Browns and the Yankees fought all season long for the pennant. Ultimately, the Browns fell just one game short. And ironically, this was the year that perhaps the law of averages caught up with Shocker, because the Yankees beat him a few times, and the score was very often just 2-1. And he had some heartbreaking losses, including a key game in late September that ultimately gave the Yankees the pennant.
And to show you what kind of team, first of all, I want to mention Babe Ruth was sidelined for 6 weeks because he disobeyed Landis's order to go barnstorming after the season ended in 1921. So the Yanks didn't have Ruth. Kenny Williams actually won the home run crown that year. I think he slugged 39 home runs, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
And George Sisler, he had a batting average of .420, which was the third highest batting average of the 20th century. This is the type of team that St. Louis was. And, you know, like we mentioned with Shaka, he was probably reached a pinnacle here, but he's still consistent after all these years. They were in first place. The Yankees caught him. But what's starting to go on now, you know, with the Yankees, with St. Louis, why is Huggins starting to get interested in Shocker again?
Well, Shocker had some terrific ball games against the Yankees. He had some amazing showdowns with Babe Ruth in the early 20s. A number of times Shocker got the better of Ruth, but a number of times Ruth homered off of him. I have one story in the book that was actually buried in a column in the Sporting News, but in the early 1920s, actually in 1920, Shocker struck Babe Ruth out 3 times in a game. The Babe was so upset afterwards he smashed his special bat against the concrete steps of the dugout. And during one at bat, Shocker actually waved his outfielders in when he was pitching to Ruth. If you can imagine such a thing, threw a slow ball and Ruth badly missed it, and then he waved his outfielders in even more. By the time there were 2 strikes on Ruth, now the outfielders were actually on the infield grass. You can imagine how the Babe felt about that. And Shocker struck him out. I mean, I'm trying to imagine if that would happen today when Mike Trout was up. I don't know what pitcher would have the moxie to do something like that, and it's almost inconceivable. But that gets into Shocker's flamboyance and his character, which in the early 1920s, perhaps other than Ruth, there was no more colorful ball player in all of baseball than Shocker, which becomes sort of paradoxical because when he came back to the Yankees, we'll get into it, he was a very, very different guy personality-wise. But he was a big, big figure in the game, and the Yankees wanted him back. At one point around 1920, Jacob Rupert, the Yankee owner, even offered Bob Quinn $100,000 for Shocker, the same amount of money that they got Babe Ruth for, and Quinn turned him down.
Now, you know what's interesting here? Shocker liked to challenge the management, and now Lee Fole was replaced by longtime Browns infielder Jimmy Austin. Now, he made a rule that Shocker didn't like, that you can't take your wives on a bus trip or something like that, and Shocker was just livid.
Right. You know, one of the amazing things about Shocker is that in the 5 years in the early 20s, when he was regularly winning 20 games a season, he missed a month of each year, either to suspension or to injury. In 1920, he missed all of September. He had a leg injury. In 22, he missed. He was pitching so often his leg gave way, and he was actually in the hospital for a month, and still had his 27 wins. One can only wonder. But in 23, Shocker did want to take his wife, and subsequently there were some papers that I uncovered that showed that the real reason why he wanted to take his wife on the road trip was that there was cancer, which you don't hear that word used that much. He wanted but his wife had cancer and wanted to visit a specialist in Philadelphia. And the owner of the team, Phil Ball, who was a very difficult guy, said no, and Shocker was suspended again for the entire month of September, and he had already won his 20 games by that point, but that was it for that season.
And then Sisler assumed command of the team in 24, but that didn't do much for St. Louis either. They were in the middle of the pack, and Shaka ran a fall of him when he showed up one day late. What was going on here?
Right, well, Sisler had an eye injury, and in 1923 didn't play at all, and the team fell off pretty quickly, and Sisler liked Shocker and wanted to work with him, but Shocker had some problems. He was he did disappear a few times during his career in St. Louis. I suspect that there may have been some drinking-related issues there, but Shocker was able to keep it more or less under control. But finally, Sisler realized, they needed to part ways. Shocker needed a new, a new home and a new environment, and it would be better for everybody always around. And after the 24th season, did pull the string on that trade.
Now, even with his colorful personality, he liked to remain alone. He wasn't one to cavort with the boys and all this. Why do you think he had this kind of independent, this kind of loner image, rather than, this kind of, even though he was outgoing and was a colorful personality?
It's a great question, Ian, and I think the loner image really emerged much more when he returned to the Yankees for the 25 season, and that was probably around the time that he was diagnosed with heart disease and what ultimately would kill him. And it happens in life to many people that at your moment of your greatest triumph, and he was obviously thrilled and overjoyed to get traded back to the Yankees. He called them my Yankees. That was the time that a dark cloud was approaching his life, and that was the illness. And I think the combination of the fact that he knew he had this serious illness, that he was told it was going to kill him, he may not have accepted it, and the fact that he was getting older, more mature, and the fact that he was back with the Yankees, that he became a very, very quiet guy and was not nearly as flamboyant later in his career. So I'm not sure. I would think that in the early 20s he was not that much of a loner, but getting the knowledge that you're not going to live for very many years could tend to affect the personality of just about anybody, and I think he did become more withdrawn.
And you know what I love about Shaka? Even with his being withdrawn, he was a ferocious reader like myself, and I'm reading it. He loved newspapers. He would get every out-of-town newspaper and read it. That's just to educate himself what was going on in the sports world, what the writers were saying about him. So he was well-read, and he was no stranger. Like a lot of the ball players of the era were pretty much ignorant. I mean, Joe Jackson, he didn't know how to read or write, and a lot of these ball players who couldn't get white-collar jobs, and it's either the factories or baseball, really, or boxing if you could do it. Let me ask you this. Now we're going back to the Yankees here, and Huggins, he's a little optimistic about his pitching staff. But his pitching staff is getting old here. We have Panic, we have Wyatt Hurt, and Sad Sam Jones. What's going on with the 24 Yankees?
Well, when Shocker came back, as you said, the Yankees had won 3 pennants, 21 through 23. Had Shocker not been traded, I think you could make an argument they probably would have won 5 in a row because they came just short in 1920 and 24. But the 25 Yankees literally collapsed. That was the year that Babe Ruth was very sick, missed a few weeks with what was called the bellyache heard around the world. And ironically, the Yankees finished in 7th place. Even the Browns finished better than they did. So Shocker was the only Yankee pitcher that year that did not have a losing record. He was 12-12, but everything went wrong with the team, and Huggins ultimately would begin to clean house there. But Shocker was one of the guys that he knew he wanted to keep because he felt Shocker was such an intense competitor and so hungry for the pennant, where perhaps some of the other players, you've won the pennant 3 times in a row. It isn't quite the same thing. but it was a disastrous season.
Let me ask you this. When we creep in with the heart disease, in your opinion and your research, I think he was diagnosed with the heart disease in 26, I believe, or early 27 on the winning. But, now we're seeing a slower Urban Shocker. Do you think he had the heart disease a while before he was diagnosed with it?
Yeah, he basically ultimately died of mitral valve failure, and nowadays if you need to have your heart valve replaced, I think you can go in and you'll be home for dinner that night. I had once had an opportunity to actually see what the little artificial valve is made like. And, yeah, there's no question it was beginning to happen. At least I think he even knew it starting in 25 because he no longer could sleep lying down. When you have that mitral valve failure, the valve doesn't seal properly, and if you're lying down, you actually get the backwash of fluids where you feel like you're drowning. And in the early 20th century, a lot of kids had scarlet fever, and one of the things that happened with scarlet fever is it would scar your heart valves, and years later it would come back to have such valve failure. I was never able to nail down whether Shocker did have scarlet fever. I would bet that he did, but it was, again, a very difficult thing. His doctor probably noticed, could hear the heart murmur even with, with the stethoscopes that they had back then. So he knew it, and it was the beginning of the end. But, again, he was going to fight it and never accepted the prognosis.
Let me ask you this. What's interesting is he kept it from everybody. Didn't the Yankees have their own doctors that can, put players through physicals and actually find this kind of stuff?
That's a great question, and you never hear much about a doctor. I mean, when Babe Ruth was sick, we talk about it in the 1921 book. He had an arm injury. The Yankees may have used a doctor. Ruth had his own doctor. I don't think they went through those physicals, and basically he kept it a secret because he felt, why publicize it? If I publicize it, then opposing batters would maybe get an edge on me, thinking, they had something on me. I certainly wouldn't want my owners of the Yankees to know about it because maybe then they wouldn't pay me as much in salary. And so he kept it under wraps. But I don't think the doctors did systematic physicals. I've never read an article about that, and if somebody knows otherwise, I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah, so would I, because, you got me thinking, reading this, I'm like, well, Shocker hit it, but don't these guys take physicals? I mean, even in World War I, during the whole campaign to get the guys, from the baseball fields to the battlefields, I just had Jimmy Leaks on my show a few weeks ago. These guys had to take physicals. So, just putting a stethoscope over his heart, like you mentioned, you'd be able to detect that. So it's really odd. That's something.
Yeah, it is a great question because you're absolutely right. In World War I, when players were drafted, they did go through physicals. Then I don't know if ball players did on a regular basis.
Well, that's something we got to research. You never know what I'm going to say. That's the beauty of this show. I don't even know what I'm going to say. I don't even know the next thing that's going to come out of my mouth. Anyway.
Okay.
Anyway, so let me ask you this. So why did Shocker decide to go on, even though he knew he was pretty much very, very sick?
Well, he loved the game, and in 1926, he came back, had a sensational year, won 19 games. He won a lot of games. He was really on his way to winning easily more than 20, which would have been his fifth year in a row. And I don't even think there are very many, if any, pitchers, I'm not an expert on this, who are not in the Hall of Fame who've won 20 games 5 years in a row. But he had a fall off late in the season, but the Yankees had a sensational comeback. We think of the Yankees of the 20s as being one long, powerful stretch, but really with 1925 in the middle there and the collapse, they really had two very different groups of teams. And the 26 through 28 Yankees, came back to win 3 pennants. And in 26, they really surprised the baseball world. And Shocker was really the key pitcher in the early months of the season that got him into first place with a big lead.
And you know,
but he loved the game. He loved the game. He didn't know what he would do outside of it, and he was going to make the most of it. And in 26, really the illness, I think, had not really taken hold dramatically, although if you begin to look at his strikeouts per year, just the raw numbers, because he's still pitching a lot of innings, his speed was, deserting him and the power. And early in the 20s, he was described as stocky, a little bit on the heavy side. And as the illness took over, especially the latter stages, he lost weight.
Let me ask you this question. I'll ask you two questions. One, in the 26 World Series, the Yanks played St. Louis. And I know you're in my Ty Cobb and the Dead Ball era site on Facebook. I got a picture of Roger Hornsby and Babe Ruth. But if memory serves me correct, and I could be wrong, wasn't the final out which propelled the St. Louis Cardinals to win Babe Ruth trying to steal second base?
Right, that was very famous, Grover Cleveland Alexander, and that was the year the Shocker finally, did make it to the World Series. Here's this aging veteran who's getting his moment in the sun. Unfortunately, he ran into another even more famous aging veteran named Grover Cleveland Alexander, and they faced off in Game 2, very dramatic game, and Shocker came out on the losing end. Alexander came back to win Game 6 and then saved Game 7 in relief. And that was perhaps, one of the most famous World Series games of all time. And
in 27, and this is the strange thing. Right now I got the Sabre article up on my screen, and he told writer Bill Corum in 27, look, I've had a bum heart for years. You've seen me sitting up late at night in my Pullman berth. I couldn't lie down, choked when I did, like we said. Do you think by him abusing his body and literally willing himself to pitch, as a normal person would, actually exacerbated his disease?
Yeah, it might have hastened it. And there was one time, in the 28th season, he hardly pitched all the way out, almost died on the baseball field when he collapsed throwing spring training. But it certainly didn't help him, and it probably would have prolonged his life had he retired. But he was a restless guy. He wanted challenges, and pitching at the highest level for the Yankees gave that to him. It was a thrill, and it still would be today to any pitcher.
Let me ask you this: why did they call him Professor Urban Shocker that year? Because James Kahn of the New York Graphic wrote, Professor Urban Shocker enjoyed his best game of the season yesterday, allowing only 4 hits, all singles, and he just says, Professor Shocker is nobody's straight man, though he makes the batters look like a very droll lot of comedians.
Yeah, the New York Graphic was actually is a very obscure New York newspaper that wasn't around for a long time. And again, Shocker had so little speed. Now, we don't really have video. We may somewhere find a clip of a few seconds, but so we don't really know to analyze it. I have a quote in there from Roger Peckinpah years later describing Shocker's slow ball, perhaps with some exaggeration, but he didn't have speed, and so he really depended on his breaking ball, on his knowledge of other pitchers to get the job done. So, it was obvious that he was pitching more with his arm than he was, with his head than he was with his arm. And hence, he was known as a cerebral guy, and James Kahn called him Professor.
And let me ask you this question. What propelled Shaka to retire in the off-season between 27 and 28?
Well, with heart disease, and I'm not a doctor, although I've certainly consulted a number of them in working on the book, in the early stages of heart disease, there's water retention and weight gain. But in the latter stages, and there's a term that I have in the book, there's significant weight loss. And late in the 1927 season, Shocker was beginning to lose weight fairly rapidly. He did not start a World Series game, even though he had an 18-6 record. And I think at that time, if Miller Huggins didn't know that he had the heart disease, we don't know exactly when Shocker confided in Huggins. It was pretty obvious there was something wrong. He had lost so much weight. I think he told Bill Corum he was down to, if you ever call him there, how many pounds? 112 or something. He had lost so much weight that if he had showed up at spring training in 1928, I mean, he was just ridiculously weak and thin, and he created this smoke screen that he was having, retiring to go into the electronics business, and then maybe there was a problem with his contract. All the while he was desperately trying to gain weight. I don't know. I have visions of him drinking a lot of milkshakes, but I don't know that to be the case. But he had to put some weight on so he could look like an athlete again.
And although he did retire, he went to Denver of all places. What the heck was he doing out in Denver to revive his career?
Well, yeah, he came back with the Yankees briefly after he had gained some weight. He only pitched in one game, and then Huggins released him. And Miller Huggins said of all the players that he ever had to release in his career, this was the most difficult one when he had to say goodbye to Shocker because Shocker just was not well. And he went out to Denver, where a lot of people would go, where the air was clean and pure, and to get well. And, of course, if you had heart disease, going up to a mile-high city was probably not the best thing to do. And Shocker, looking for another challenge, took up flying airplanes. And so here is somebody with heart disease living in a mile-high city and then flying airplanes, even at greater altitudes. Not the best thing for his heart. And ultimately, we remember Lou Gehrig and his famous farewell speech. We do not remember such a speech with Shocker, because he felt he would go and get better and beat that thing and triumphantly return to New York. He never did, obviously.
And what's interesting here? Yeah, I saw the flying thing. I'm like, Jesus Christ, the guy has a bum heart. And he's going up in the air, and he has this infatuating with flying. The doctor said Shocker had died of an athletic heart. Your research shows a little bit different here. Well, let's talk about his death and what he died from.
Yeah, well, the heart disease, I mean, it's interesting, and I include some information on that. In the 1920s, there was some thought that athletes, because they exerted so much that ultimately their exercise and their performance killed them because it did something to their heart. Obviously, that was not the case, and some people, including heavyweight champion Gene Tunney, spoke out very strongly against that. So Shocker basically just had that heart failure, and there's no question his heart was enlarged. I was never able to get my hands on the autopsy, whether it's probably long destroyed. And ultimately, when he died in Denver Hospital, it was pneumonia that got him, but it was the heart failure that was really the primary cause of death.
Now, what was very interesting was with their World Series money, they gave Rene Shocker the $500 for his winnings from 1927, I believe, which was very nice of them. But what's really, really, deja vu here, and this is like something that's like out of like magic or something. As Shocker died on September 9th, there was something going on.
Actually in 27 he got the full World Series share because he was a key performer that season. In 28 they did give his wife $500, and 28 was the year that the Yankees had an enormous lead of 13.5 game over Connie Mack's Athletics. The Athletics staged an enormous comeback, and on September 8th, the day before Shocker died, the Athletics actually came all the way back and took a half-game lead over the Yankees. The teams opened on September 9th with a doubleheader. It was perhaps the biggest crowd in Yankee Stadium history, even though I've seen the Yankee Flyers refer to a different game. There was the listed attendance was 85-some-odd thousand, and that was the day that Shocker died, and that was the day that the Yankees swept the doubleheader from the A's before the game started. When the A's were taking batting practice, Babe Ruth walked up to them and said, "How does it feel to be in first place? You guys better enjoy it because you're not going to be there by the end of the day." And the day that Shocker died, the Yankees did sweep, and they went on to hold on and keep the Athletics at bay at least one last year before they became a powerhouse. But it is pretty amazing, and it's not clear, the different newspaper accounts, whether the Yankees knew just before the doubleheader or they found out after that Shocker had died. He did die that morning before the games.
And
but
you know,
maybe, yeah.
Doug, and you know something? What's interesting? People don't realize, how big Connie Mack was. This was his second dynasty. And, I think in 28, Ty Cobb and Tris Speaker were on the 28 A's.
Athletics?
Yeah,
they were.
Yeah, they were. And because I told you, the whole Dutch Leonard affair, they had to resign from Detroit and Cleveland. And so Speaker went to Washington for a year. But Connie Mack, he was rebuilding. And this is the pivotal point, pretty much, when Shaka had died, that now we see the ending of one dynasty, and here comes Connie Mack with his second dynasty right on the horizon. It's almost poetic.
Right. Well, the Yankees won 3 pennants from 26 to 28. The A's would win 3 from 29 to 31. And at some point, and maybe September 9th or September 8th, 1928 was the time that the pendulum, the power was right in the middle. It was very definitely swinging one way because in 29, the Yankees didn't come close to winning the pennant. The A's did, and it was almost the perfect tipping point between one powerhouse that was about to leave and another one that was about to take over. Pretty amazing that you'd have back-to-back 2-3-year dynasties of teams this powerful. And on September 9th, they were, Lefty Grove was the star of that team. Jimmy Fox was on that team, Al Simmons. When the Yankees played the A's during 1928, I think that might have been the year that there were the most future Hall of Famers of all time on a baseball field. And I think it was earlier in the 28 season when the two teams met.
I think Eddie Collins was on the team, if I'm not mistaken, as well. I forget.
Right, and then he became the coach of the team. Yeah, it was a blend of veterans and youngsters, and Jimmy Fox was just emerging. Actually, he got his first home run off the Shocker a couple of years earlier.
I know, like you mentioned, Al Simmons, great athletics teams that would dominate the early 30s until the Yankees were able to get back. And, of course, have their wonderful run from 36 to 39, which a book is coming out next year on that. But let me ask you this. Did I forget anything? Do you want to say any last words about Urban Shaka?
Well, a couple things I would just quickly mention. In the 26 World Series, I have a whole chapter on that. It's fascinating how Shocker lost Game 2 when he gave up a 3-run home run down that short right field porch to Billy Southworth. And, we don't have any film of it. Did Shocker make a mistake? Did he actually pitch to Southworth's strength? But it is so ironic. We sometimes forget, ballparks have different dimensions in them. And I have a quote out there of Miller Huggins after Shocker gave up a 315-foot pop fly home run, and another quote from the Bobby Cox of the Atlanta in the late 90s when Chuck Knobloch hit one, and Knobloch and Huggins were saying the same thing. So it was a crushing defeat in the 1926 series, and obviously it was a difficult thing for him to accept. But Shocker, had a great career. He actually brought Rogers Hornsby up when he was manager of the Cardinals, and of course Hornsby led the 26 team that beat him. And if I can give a plug for Saber, Saber has just come out with a book on Sportsman's Park, which has the greatest games in the history of Sportsman's Park, which is where the Browns and the Cardinals play. I've got an article on the Little World Series in 1922, the game that propelled the Yankees to the pennant. and biographies of the owner of the Browns, the two owners of the Browns, Bob Hedges and Phil Ball. It's a fascinating book that's just come out, and I would recommend it.
Well, you're going to have to send it to me. So anyway, we're going to have to have you on the show again, Steve, because, these hours that we do just goes by really quick.
It does.
Well, anyway, where can we find the book besides Amazon and online? I know you got your site, stevesteinberg.com or .org, one of the two. Where can we find this wonderful book?
Yeah, well, on my website is stevesteinberg.net. You can really find it anywhere, online, and any bookstore can order it. University of Nebraska Press did a terrific job. I love the way they're so professional, and the cover alone will grab you. It's a picture of Shocker, portrait of him as a Yankee late in his career, wearing his Yankee sweater, with really a strong sense of contentment now that he's back with my Yankees, as he put it. And so the book is definitely out there, and it's a great read. As with the other books that I've done with Lyle Spatz, I tend to put a lot of information in endnotes in the back, not just citations, which does two things. It keeps the story moving, and if you do want more information, you've got many, many pages of endnotes that provide you with additional information and leads to other stories.
I always enjoy your books. This is the third one. You've been on the show 3 times. We're going to get you back for the next book that's coming out. Hang on. I'm going to close the show. I'll speak to you right after I close the show. Folks, go out, get Urban Shaka, a great read. Go get for your baseball fan this Christmas or Hanukkah or whatever you celebrate in December. You won't be disappointed. Keep you warm during the January months. As always, I'm Ian Kahanowitz. You are listening to the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Thank you, Steve, for being on the show. And in the immortal words of Edward R. Murrow, good luck, good night, and good luck.
Thanks.